Welcome to Carbon Politics, a CSE podcast series decoding the politics of climate change from the lens of the Global South. In this series, we will explore multiple critical questions that are surrounding and pressuring the climate debate today. What happens next on multilateralism, or where is the current trade system going? And how does the global financial architecture need to be reformed? How are these systems influencing the ability of developing countries to address, respond to, and adapt to climate change? These are some of the critical questions we hope to answer, and we hope you join us on this journey this year. Hi everyone, welcome to Carbon Politics, a video podcast by the Center for Science and Environment that decodes the politics of climate change from the lens of the Global South. I'm Avantika Goswami from CSE, and today's episode features two, I want to say almost celebrity guests from the climate analysis research space. We have with us two very good friends of ours, Tim Sahay and Kate Mackenzie. For many of you, they don't need an introduction, but for those of you who do, Tim and Kate are co-editors of the Polycrisis publication at Phenomenal World that focuses on the political economy of climate with an emphasis on the Global South. Individually, they both have very illustrious careers as well. Kate has worked at the Financial Times and Bloomberg Green, covering energy and finance, and is a fellow at Macquarie University in Australia. And Tim is co-director at the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at the Johns Hopkins University, in addition to advising various Global South governments and doing a bunch of other cool stuff. So hi guys, welcome to Carbon Politics, and thanks for being here today. Tim, I feel like you're a regular. This is your third CSE event.
Not in Delhi this time.
Not in Delhi this time, but it obviously means that we are big fans. Kate, we love your work. It's so instructive for us. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you too. It's really great to be here. It's such important work that you guys are doing.
Thank you. So today we're talking about, within the lens of your polycrisis writing, there's so many things that we typically delve into. But today I'm going deep into one specific country grouping, which is of great interest to a lot of different stakeholders and entities right now. We're talking about the BRICS, a grouping of originally 5 countries, but which has now expanded to almost 20 plus countries, all in various affiliations. There are core BRICS members, then there are core, beyond the core BRICS partner countries. What they mostly have in common, and I say mostly, is that they are emerging and developing economies, most of them with growing energy demand, massive growth and industrial aspirations. And they're coming under focus quite a bit right now in this very disruptive moment, where you have a retreat of Western leadership from all arenas, particularly on climate. So the US is essentially a petrostate and is going even more bullish down that path. So what is the role of BRICS on climate action? That's what I want to get into today. And I want to draw upon both Tim and Kate's work, which goes deep into industrial strategies, finance, technology transfer, and very sort of real economy issues like that, to really examine, can the BRICS be a viable force for positive climate action, or do they still have a long way to go? So these are some of the questions I want to get to today. So with that, I'll start off throwing out the first one to both of you. Your work has delved a lot into the green industrial strategy question, and this is something that BRICS are pursuing tentatively. Do you see this as being a key lever for BRICS to lead on climate action? And sort of, does it balance out BRICS's other massive dependency, which is fossil fuels in large parts of their economy? So yeah, I'd love to hear from either of you on this.
Thanks, Avantika. I'll go. I'll jump in. To put it simply, energy, trade, geopolitics, and finance and economics are no longer in silos. So, and thinking through those connections is one of the reasons why we started the Polycrisis. And, it's also why we're really excited about this podcast and the work that CSE is doing, exploring the kind of intersection of these topics from a global South perspective, because that's also one of the kind of key tenets of the Polycrisis. So yeah, with your question around the BRICS countries as kind of climate leaders or what the kind of potential there is, I think it's important to start with the understanding that clean energy for BRICS countries is not about climate necessarily. I think there's a degree to which some of the core BRICS countries, and I'm mostly just talking about the original BRICS countries here, certainly some of them want to be seen or value being seen as climate leaders or as responsible climate actors. China and India being examples, South Africa as well. But it's and pretty much all of them except Russia, perhaps. But clean energy has become really. It's not really that connected to climate goals in terms of how it manifests in their domestic policies and their in a lot of their international relations. It's really about their overall economic and even their security strategies. So not just their energy, not just their energy security strategies, but their actual kind of broader economic strategy, growth, development. Clean energy is now a really integral part of that for BRICS countries in different ways, right? So as you said, there's definitely quite a variation there. But it's hard to talk about BRICS without focusing quite a bit on China initially, which is because China is just this. It's a powerhouse. It's probably the first electro-state that it's 30% of its energy is through electricity now, delivered through electricity, which is a lot higher than other, even Western countries that have been pursuing clean energy for a long time have seemingly kind of stuck at around the low to mid 20%. That in itself is a really critical part of getting to a clean energy system is electrification. But apart from that, China's also its role in the broader world as a green tech innovator and a manufacturing powerhouse. So a manufacturer of green tech is just it's just sort of singular really in how we think about how climate action, how climate mitigation is progressing now. So Tim can talk more about some of those aspects, I think, like the manufacturing side and the innovation. But I'll just say also there's probably three main drivers of the new geopolitics of the green transition. There's power, just sort of generally global powers shifting more towards the East, or what's sort of commonly called the East. There's also energy as a means of sovereignty. That's become, I think, because the opportunities to obtain energy sovereignty are so much richer now and more pressing. And then there's a third thing, which is that energy is about manufacturing as much as extraction or more than extraction, and that's again, like that's quite a shift in what has been the model for nearly a couple of centuries now. So the first thing I mentioned, shifting power relations, is that then there's power going out of these the sort of transatlantic Western core countries, the big sort of established Western powers, and towards the fast-growing dynamic East and South countries that are represented in the BRICS, at least to an extent, and then there's you can see that in the declining share of the economy of global economy that's held by G7 countries as opposed to BRICS. So in 2000, for example, the UK economy was about the same size as India and China combined. It actually seems unbelievable to think of that now. And now you could fit 5 UKs inside China's economy. Second one is that I mentioned is the material remaking of energy, going from fossil fuels, which only some countries have in abundance, to green energy that's more about manufacturing and new machines. So EVs, solar panels, batteries, wind. And this is why a lot of countries are looking and thinking about green industrial policy as their engine of growth and development, or as a critical step to getting there and to enabling growth and development. And again, there's like a simple data point there, which is global investments in clean energy are twice as big as investments in fossil fuel these days. So it's 2 trillion to 1 trillion roughly, according to the International Energy Agency. The third one is that countries, including the powerful BRICS countries, want energy sovereignty. They don't want to be dependent on imported oil and gas, which most of them are to some extent. And this is critical, right? Like where you get your energy from is so fundamental to your economy and your society, and that vulnerability of being dependent on imports, as say China, India are, and to an extent South Africa and Brazil, that's a massive vulnerability, and it's compounded by the US dollar system. Obviously, most of these commodities tend to be priced in dollars, and you can end up in quite a difficult situation. This is more the case, even more the case for smaller developing countries and poorer developing countries, and we've seen that in the last few years. And it leads to social discontent. People get angry. You're vulnerable. It creates security vulnerabilities. So so there's all of that shift. And now that it's possible to move more towards this manufactured style of energy, less reliance on this constant stream of imported, volatile, in terms of price and chemically volatile, I guess, substances, particularly oil and gas. That's super important.
I'm going to dial back to you on that dollar question, the dollar dependence and other types of dependency in a minute. But I want to kind of expand a little bit on something that you said. Clean energy for BRICS is no longer just about, actually, maybe it never has been just about climate. It's about security. It's about growth, development. And so central to all of this as a driving force is China, as you mentioned. So Tim, I want to come to you. And so you guys have written recently that in the increasingly hamstrung West, each headline-grabbing advance by China is read as another Sputnik moment, giving rise to fresh anxieties and the push for an ambitious policy response. So how is China's role? I mean, we know that it's basically some kind of a climate savior at this point. It's also a manufacturing powerhouse. How has China's role in this equation been evolving over time, and how does that affect its relationship with other BRICS countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially what Kate was saying, that it's a manufacturing powerhouse that is turning into the first electrostate. So the question to ask is, wait a second, hang on. Like, we've been thinking about China for a long time as this sort of copycat country that doesn't really know how to innovate, but is copying advances from the West. That picture is 10 to 20 years out of date. But that's a very commonly held assumption in people's head, that it's China produces, what the China price, or, the China mal, as we say in India, like it's just going to be cut price, low quality goods. That picture is 10 to 20 years out of date. China is now producing high quality, technologically advanced goods. BYD, the car company, in the solar panels, advances in AI, advances in digitalization and robotics. You kind of go down the list of all of the high-tech sectors. And China is no longer a copycat economy, but it is actually innovating and producing patents, producing scientific publications, some of the leading universities in the world. So it's just in the last 20 years completely dramatically flipped the story upside down. And that is why we said it's kind of like the Sputnik moment, right? Like that was a measure of the Soviets, putting a satellite in space. And now it's like China, oh my God, these amazingly good and cheap, high quality cars are coming out and really upsetting political coalitions in countries that make cars and are like, holy cow, like our consumers just want this much nicer product. So those are the sort of the two sort of big upside down moments that the rest of the world is now trying to attract a highly advanced Chinese industry to their lands so that they can learn from them and actually partake in some of these new technological advances. And that's just stunning. Like at least for the United States, it just like kind of breaks everyone's head because the West has been the leader of advanced technologies. You can start the cycle 200 years ago, 300 years ago, whenever you want to really start. And so what does it mean for the West, particularly the US, particularly Europe, to be in a state of technological dependence from China? And what we are basically seeing is the presence of China within the BRICS, where in some sense they are doing some more cooperation with BRICS countries on technology deals. So, India's largest EV maker is a tie-up between a Chinese EV maker, SAIC, and the Jindal Steel Group, right? So the fastest selling EV in India is the MG Motor car. The India's fastest selling sort of EV buses are made by BYD. It's made in Hyderabad and in Chennai. It's like a manufacturing plant. Again, it's a tie-up with domestic Indian firms where Chinese firms are working with Indian engineers, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I mean by it's like an upside down kind of world. And whichever camp China finds itself in is just going to be sort of more technologically advanced than the camp that is opposed to Chinese technology.
So there is, if I stay with you for a minute, Tim, there is a lot of mistrust in BRICS as a coalition. And for legitimate reasons, this is what history has kind of shown us, not just about BRICS, but in terms of even a wider global South solidarity. So there's also this kind of disbelief that the BRICS will reduce their fossil dependence anytime soon. So, I'm saying this, I think, coming from the climate movement, the climate diplomacy community. Are you seeing any concrete ideas, policies emerging from the BRICS efforts that show that there may be some actually meaningful efforts to advance on climate and also simultaneously claim more power in global governance? And if yes, no, can these concrete actions lead to some sort of solidarity among the BRICS countries to advance this agenda? Can those concrete schemes, ideas push forward and build viable political coalitions?
Yeah, there's a lot there, but like the first thing to just start off is domestic action. The first thing that you mentioned, like how are these fossil-rich countries? India is massive on coal, China is massive on coal, and the Emiratis are a petro state. How are these oil and gas and coal sort of rich countries, are they actually transforming domestically? That's the first big question. And there, we've had a really significant crossover point where now less than half of BRICS electricity comes from fossil fuels. So these countries have been going green steadily and surely for the last decade, and we have reached a tipping point where less than half of their electricity comes from fossil fuels. So that's very significant. Then the next question, that's great, that's electricity. What's happening? Where are the new power plants being built? Is it mainly solar and wind, or is it mainly oil and gas? And there, the ratio is 2:1. It's very similar to the ratio that Kate just said, right? Like $2 trillion of global investment going into clean energy, 1 trillion going to fossil fuels. When you look at BRICS countries, there are twice as many new wind and solar power projects in development than new projects funded by coal, oil, and gas. So that just tells you that domestically, there's a transition and there's a tipping point, and now we're going to see more and more cleaner grids and more faster climate action. That's just and just to like put that point in, like India, China, and Brazil are three of the world's fastest growing solar installing markets. So that is a big shift. Now, the big question about, okay, great, you're doing stuff domestically for your own reasons, energy sovereignty, whatever. What does that mean for you collectively? That's the thrust of your question. Are you doing something new collectively? And there, partly because this was Brazil's BRICS presidency, and Brazil has been a climate champion since the 1992 Rio summit, since the very beginning of this whole thing. And so they basically said, right, like if the United States is just completely out of the game, the United States has walked out of the climate game and is the world's largest oil and gas producer, what can we as BRICS countries do to demonstrate our collective efforts? And there they've basically said, well, we have a bank, we have the BRICS Bank. Can we make sure that we use it to support green investments, green infrastructure kind of projects? And they basically said 30% of our loans going from the BRICS Bank should be going to supporting green infrastructure. So that's an element of their collective action. The second part is like BRICS didn't really talk much about climate, and the Brazilians were like, we should talk about climate. We should take up this space and make sure that the large bulk of the world is going to act on climate, regardless of the Americans walking out. And in fact, we should do more of it because the Americans were actually one of the oil and gas powers that were holding us back. So that's the very first climate finance cooperation that they, put out a statement that basically said, right, we have a bunch of domestic banks. We should support those national development banks by the multilateral banks. So the big world banks and, the larger Asian Infrastructure Bank, AIIB, etc. These banks should be supporting our national banks to go green, so that this finance question, we can sort of get international support to support our national development banks. And then the third place where they said, let's do something concrete is exactly what we were just talking about, the technology cooperation side. Let's set up a technology sharing platform. We are clearly doing a bunch of stuff together on EVs, batteries, solar, but these are just kind of mainly bilateral efforts where it's Brazil and India working on biofuels, so China and the Emiratis working on solar, or China and India working on batteries and cars, etc. Can we actually set up a more multinational sort of cooperative agency to share our technology, to learn from each other, to do some scientific training, to do some engineer exchanges, etc., etc. So these are just like really important initiatives on money and that climate finance stuff, and on technology, and then lastly on trade, which maybe we can talk about later.
Thank you. That was super useful. And I feel like maybe it's very important also in this kind of new narrative building. I guess one of the things I've been thinking about with respect to BRICS is kind of like this new green agency that they have in a sense. So there is still fossil fuel incumbency, but there's also a lot of green intent, and that green intent is tied very deeply to growth and security questions, so very sort of existential for these countries. I feel like there's going to be more and more focus on, let's look to the BRICS as climate leaders, and they can, they can lift the load now that the US is clearly, the seat that the US is clearly vacating. And that's going to create some problems, I think, from a climate and equity and justice perspective, because many BRICS countries are, after all, developing countries. I guess in that vein, BRICS countries are still very dependent, being subordinate in the global economy, being developing countries. They're still dependent for capital, for technology, for access to very rich consumer markets, all in the global north. So we should talk a lot about South-South cooperation, trade, building our own green agenda, but then how do we reckon with these dependencies that we continue to have with the rich world? Kate, if you'd like to come in on this, and how should BRICS navigate this question?
Yeah, look, it's not easy. There's in terms of the US and dependence on the US, or at least a kind of a constraints exercised by the US. There's dollar dependence, and there's dependence on US export markets to varying degrees for different countries, but it's significant for a lot of countries. And then in many cases also there's some pretty strong security ties and dependencies there, security and defense dependencies. But the dollar system is a real constraint that affects what a lot of countries can do in terms of changing things quickly, creating a new more equitable global system, global financial architecture. It's very, very hard to make these things happen fast. But all of these dependencies, these are reasons why in these negotiations that Trump and the White House are having with other countries, we're seeing a lot of these deals accompanying the tariff discussions. So it's kind of a show of deference. These very loose pledges to buy American LNG or unspecified energy exports, make investments, create hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investments. We think that longer term, medium term, obviously countries are just going to be kind of edging away from a dependence on the US because it's increasingly, just becomes so erratic and unreliable. So we think a lot of these deals won't, a lot of these sort of side deals accompanying the tariff discussions are not really going to materialize, not in the way that they're first described anyway. We've been calling them empanada deals. That was Tim's excellent acronym. After the Trump always chicken taco acronym, Tim, that sort of became less the case. But Tim came up with empanada, which is everyone makes deals and everyone makes promises and no one does anything. So these hundreds of billions of dollars, for example, described in the Japanese American talks, they're not necessarily going to materialize, and you can see in the conversations immediately afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just take that up on the sovereignty kind of question. I mean, you look at the US kind of weaponizing access to the US market, right? So it basically says, why should you guys expect that you can sell into a market? Market access to the US is a privilege, not a right. That's what they say, right? It's a privilege. You have to earn that privilege. It's like entering an exclusive club. You have to give a fee to the club. The fee is the rate of tariff that we put on you. If you happen to be a close ally, that, it might be 10 or 15% is the club entrance fee. If you're somebody like India, it could be 20, it could be 30%. And if you're on the outs, if you're an enemy of the United States or whatever, which it turns out Switzerland is an enemy of the United States, like it's facing a 39% tariff. The Brazilians, the Indians, you could face a 50% tariff. So there's like a tiered hierarchical structure with different club entrance fees. And if you're a country that is facing up to this, you could do what Kate just said, which is just empanada deals. Just say you're going to do these things. You don't actually have to deliver on them. Just placate them. And then the second sort of thing is just like, wait a second, they are asking us to do very political things for lower club entrance fees. So the South Africans are being asked, stop doing your land reform. What do you mean you're doing all of this land reform and this, hyper concentrated land ownership amongst whites in South Africa? And they're trying this government for the last, is just trying to redistribute land. And so the Americans are saying, if you do that, we're going to slap you with higher tariffs. To the Brazilians, they say, if you're carrying out these court proceedings against this guy, Bolsonaro, who literally tried to assassinate Lula, we might slap you with a higher tariff. To the Indians, they're saying, if you're buying Russian oil and you put it in your refineries and you feed, we might try. So these are very political sovereignty kinds of things, and countries really don't like it when you like mess with their sovereignty. So I think what you're basically going to see is a lot of countries just sort of, just sort of do say that they're doing something in the short term, but in the long term, just try and eliminate all parts of dependence upon the dollar, upon the US markets. And the main thing that they really need to do is strengthen their domestic consumer markets and to diversify away from the US markets to do more kind of South-South trade. And literally everybody is trying that out. The Europeans are talking to the Brazilians, the Indians are talking to the BRICS. So there's just like a slow motion move away from the US.
Yeah. So essentially, empanada deals in the short term, and then delinking, strengthening domestic markets, more South-South trade
Delinking, diversification,
in the
and
long term.
decarbonization, and maybe
Delinking.
de-dollarization in the long term. I mean, we've been stressing the 3Ds: decarbonization, diversification, and eventually de-dollarization, because a ton of the things that countries buy in dollars are energy and food, oil and gas, and they want to produce those things locally with those green energy goods, which means that you don't need dollars quite as much.
The triple D agenda for BRICS. We have to come up with a better name for that, probably. But cool. Thank you so much. I have to pause here, but I mean, we could talk for hours. I know, Tim, you're known to do 6-hour-long podcasts, which people listen to every minute of those, by the way. We love listening to them. And Kate, thank you so much for your additions here as well. So I think the BRICS question... the BRICS question remains open. There are promising signs. There's definitely, I feel like, a need to reframe the climate narrative from BRICS being these fossil-hungry, absolutely brown energy, high-carbon economies to kind of thinking about how they are trying to engage with the green transition in nuanced, complex, deliberate ways. There are still many open questions about the dependencies that they have and how they will navigate threats to their political sovereignty in a very, very weird geopolitical environment today, spearheaded by the US. But I think this is a conversation we need to keep having, and we will keep following what you guys research, put out, opine on this. But thank you so much for being here today. And that's the end of today's episode.